And so I think it's really good for you to unpack segregation that way. It is a term that suggests one group is perpetrating evil on the other group.
Segregation also, particularly in the U.S. context, you can start to see its impact over generations. You control all of these systems, then you start to subjugate another group of humans.
Hey there, if you've joined the podcast today, my name is Chris Jarvis. I work with companies on employee giving and volunteering programs.
And my name's Jake McIsaac. I spend a lot of time thinking about public safety and restorative justice.
So we are having conversations here that we've been having for 20 years.
Yeah, the only difference now is we press record and share it with you.
Thanks for joining us. So in today's episode, we're going to try and discuss the horrific events unfolding in Palestine. It is a complex situation. There's this tangled web of politics, power, historical wounds, but Jake and I are going to try and discuss the people at the center of this, the people, their families, their lives that hang in the balance of this horrible crisis.
We can't let the hardship or complexity paralyze our morality. People are dying. When politics and principles fail, what does it look like to take a stand against this violence? What does justice require of us right now?
So my partner shared a video.
Yeah, no, I had a chance to review it.
Yeah, an interview. His last name is Coates. What's his first name?
Last night, Ta-Nehisi Coates participated in another event hosted by organizers of the Palestine Festival of Literature, or PALFest. Ta-Nehisi is the recipient of a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship and the recipient of numerous prizes, including the National Book Award for his book, Between the World and Me. We Were 8 Years in Power is another book, An American Tragedy, and his memoir, The Beautiful Struggle. His novel is titled The Water Dancer. In 2014, he wrote an award-winning cover story for The Atlantic magazine, headlined The Case for Reparations. Ta-Nehisi, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us under extremely difficult circumstances.
So before we begin, we want to let you hear a little bit of Coates and what he's talking about. So we're going to set it up with a section here, and then we'll have a little discussion. But then we want to come back and actually ask a couple of questions that I think Jake and I find pretty tough to answer coming out of his stuff. So here, take a listen.
Can you talk about your experience being in the West Bank, going to the occupied territories, and how it changed you?
I spent 10 days in Palestine, in the occupied territories, and in Israel proper. I've had the great luxury over the past 10 years of seeing a few countries. I have not spent more time or seen more of another country or another territory than I did this summer. I think what shocked me the most was in any sort of opinion piece or reported piece or whatever you want to call it that I've read about Israel and about the conflict with the Palestinians, there's a word that comes up all the time, and it is complexity. That and its closely related adjective, complicated. And so while I had my skepticisms and I had my suspicions of the Israeli government, of the occupation, what I expected was that I would find a situation in which it was hard to discern right from wrong. It was hard to understand the morality at play. It was hard to understand the conflict. And perhaps the most shocking thing was I immediately understood what was going on over there. Probably the best example I can think of is the second day when we went to Hebron, and the reality of the occupation became clear. We were driving out of East Jerusalem. I was with PALFest, and we were driving out of East Jerusalem into the West Bank, and you could see the settlements, and they would point out the settlements, and it suddenly dawned on me that I was in a region of the world where some people could vote and some people could not. And that was obviously very, very familiar to me. I got to Hebron, and we got out as a group of writers, and we were given a tour by a Palestinian guide. And we got to a certain street, and he said to us, I can't walk down this street. If you want to continue, you have to continue without me. And that was shocking to me. And we walked down the street, and we came back, and there was a market area. Hebron is very, very poor. It wasn't always very poor, but it is very, very poor. Its market area has been shut down. But there are a few vendors there that I wanted to support. And I was walking to try to get to the vendor, and I was stopped at a checkpoint. Checkpoints all through the city. Checkpoints obviously all through the West Bank. Your mobility is completely inhibited, and the mobility of the Palestinians is totally inhibited. And I was walking to the checkpoint, and an Israeli guard stepped out, probably about the age of my son. And he said to me, "What's your religion, bro?" And I said, "Well, I don't, I'm not really religious." And he said, "Come on, stop messing around. What is your religion?" I said, I'm not playing. I'm not really religious. And it became clear to me that unless I professed my religion and the right religion, I wasn't going to be allowed to walk forward. So he said, "Well, okay, so what was your parents' religion?" I said, "Well, they weren't that religious either." He says, what were your grandparents' religion?" And I said, "My grandmother was a Christian." And then he allowed me to pass. And it became very, very clear to me what was going on there. And I have to say, it was quite familiar. Again, I was in a territory where your mobility is inhibited, where your voting rights are inhibited, where your right to the water is inhibited, where your right to housing is inhibited, and it's all inhibited based on ethnicity. And that sounded extremely, extremely familiar to me. And so the most shocking thing about my time over there was how uncomplicated it actually is. Now, I'm not saying the details of it are not complicated. History is always complicated. Present events are always complicated. But the way this is reported in the Western media is as though one needs a PhD in Middle Eastern studies to understand the basic morality of holding a people in a situation in which they don't have basic rights, including the right that we treasure most, the franchise, the right to vote, and then declaring that state a democracy. It's actually not that hard to understand. It's actually quite familiar to those of us with a familiarity to African-American history.
We should set this up to a little bit about his identity, right? So I think that's an important part that just kind of got skipped right over there in the intro.
Yeah.
This writer is a Black man from, I believe, New York, or at least that's where the interview is coming from. And it seems to be that he was part of a delegation that left the U.S., traveled to Israel and Palestine, and then is coming back wrestling with what that trip has meant and taught him, and it's almost a version of his inward journey, like we've been doing so far on this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just, while we're talking, I opened up his Wikipedia page. I see that he's actually from Baltimore. I wonder if he still lives here. Anyways, and he's famous for his correspondence with New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and more. So, it was a fascinating interview, and the interview stands on its own, despite any credentials Coates might have. But so, thanks for taking a look at it. And I know it intersects with as you just said, a lot of the things that we talk about, and there's no way we can have record a podcast now and not talk about this. We haven't recorded anything since the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Right. And even in saying that, it's so hard to
I know. I'm
the words, right? I'm watching you work through, like, how do I even frame this up and even describe conflict? And so, I think just being completely transparent that these are really difficult conversations. They're layered, they're intersecting, and they have a rich context that anyone talking about it does so with some fear and trepidation, some inherent risk, I think, of getting it wrong, or that the response to whatever said will be read as wrong. and
Mm-hmm.
insensitive. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's just a matter of saying it out loud, and we already know that.
Well, and this is kind of the point of it. Like, here's a journalist who went and had an experience, and he came back, and obviously the link will be there, and we'll do a little bit of a write up, and we're probably gonna have to talk about this for a couple of episodes. But what was the opening line? It was something about do you feel you can explain the complexity? And he said, yeah, I went thinking it's going to be complex. There's lots of history. There's lots of political perspectives. There's lots of international interference between the United States and Russia and Iran and all of the other countries that they've corralled to be on their side. They're all in there meddling, creating the situation, not just now, but for decades. And yet the disorienting dilemma for him was, yeah, it's not complicated. It's very straightforward.
Well, he, spoiler alert, but why I think it landed so well with us is because he has this human-centered, like as soon as he puts the human in the center of this conversation, it stops being a both sides piece. It starts to look at identity. It looks at struggle, what people need to be safe, well, and whole, and live justly with one another. And so using that analysis, he starts to unpack very succinctly and then hang it against the scaffold of his own experiences growing up in the U.S., which was fascinating.
Yeah, as a Black American.
Mm-hmm.
So in our conversation, we don't want anybody to be confused. We are not making a geopolitical analysis here. We are not getting into the history, and we are not trying to argue any reasonableness or anything from a political or geographical or historical perspective. We are talking about a human being who showed up as an Israeli, or showed up as a Palestinian, or showed up as a Black American, or showed up as a white guy like me. We're here now. We're all human beings. So what does this mean, as you just said, from that human-centered perspective? So do you think, Jake, we're going to come across a little naive, though, if we leave off those other, not that we're going to leave off the context, but we're not going to allow them to be the determining variables?
I'm hoping it's a bit of a pathway to folks doing their own learning.
Okay.
I think if I'm going to be really honest with you, and by extension with anyone listening, I've been quite angry with myself over the last month because I've had to do sort of high stakes learning at a fevered pace.
Okay.
There's just so much content out there. And I've been able to, in my privilege, live without ever turning my head and my mind to this in any substantive way.
Yeah.
For most of my life, even though the context has been ongoing for all of my life, I've not had to think about it in any meaningful way, other than a nod here, a nod there.
Well, wait, there was the time, and I don't want to interrupt the point you're going to make, but I do want to go back, because you actually introduced me to this issue in a meaningful way. But what were you going to say?
So we're going to talk about the kid at the youth drop-in center.
Yeah, were there two or just one kid?
There were two, but I'll come back to that in a second. But for me, it was trying to get caught up very quickly, and then realizing it's in some ways being very thankful that I have some skills around critical thinking,
and a lot of information in this space because of your restorative work and because you think through things like intersectionality. You've taken courses. I mean, you're actually swimming in a pond with a lot more to work with than most of the people, and you still felt like you were underwater.
Yeah, but I think it is doing some of the resisting, even going back to like church work, where it's sometimes would require you to say, think about the context, think about the history, go back, get multiple sources, slow down, jumping right in. There's way too many people that pick up a religious text and just read it and feel some kind of goosebumps, and they think that means, and they never ever have to wrestle with, what does the text mean?
Right.
Like, if you read anything else or read the context, it certainly wouldn't lead you there. But out of context, I can see how an idiot would get there. Congratulations. So I've been really slowing down sort of the intake of social media to say, think about the context, watch lots of different sources.
Mm-hmm. Where's this coming from? Is there an agenda? I have actually, for a few minutes, I had a lot coming in that obviously was from some sort of lobbyist group, paid for by the Israeli government, just lobbying hard on the TikTok feed. Not anymore. It's been overwhelmed by real images of what's going on, which is good, but also awful too. So, and I know just saying that, unless we're willing to just slow down and go, okay, nobody's making a judgment about the rights and wrongs that probably should happen somewhere by somebody. This is just a conversation about who we are in this moment. I'd hope that you and I would have this conversation in 1942 or 43 when the horrors of World War II were starting to come out beyond just
the ideologies, right? So as it became clear, the ideology of hate and the latency of this, hate being like the rebar in concrete that just is absolutely the thing that keeps the system and structure whole.
Yeah, that's a good way.
We then shouldn't be surprised then when it's starting to show up in these conflicts. So we do see the fingerprints of white supremacy. Yeah. We do see the fingerprints of power and oppression. It does help us start to break down to, so what else is happening? Yep. What else is going on here?
Yep.
Which I think are some of the root questions.
And in our starting place is that all human beings, because we have a common ancestor, we share these biases. We share these unconscious cognitive biases, these implicit biases. There's not a human being on the planet who in that situation wouldn't act in a very similar way to what we're seeing over there. So just because we're lucky enough not to be born into that doesn't mean that doesn't live within us. And I think that's the point you're making with the rebar and the concrete, is that unless we're doing the intentional work of being honest and seeing it in our own life, when occasions help us reflect on it, unfortunately, like this horrible, horrible thing that's happening, we can just blissfully never have to deal with it. And just in my case, enjoy the privilege. Whereas other people their lot is just to deal with it because I've decided it's not my job to deal with it. You know what I mean? Like that's the incongruity of it. The less I think it's my responsibility, the more I make it everybody else's responsibility to survive my ignorance.
Ignorance is probably a really important word. Just to give context around it, you started to frame up that incident at the youth drop-in center. So I was working, just for context, I was working at a youth drop-in center, had a number of inner city youth, sort of some gang affiliated and otherwise, that were coming out. And it was a fun, but could be testy crowd at times. And so we had different games that we would play. And among the most interesting games, they would just like to do like competitions, like push-up competitions or chin-ups, or who was better than each other. And so on this one particular day, there were two new kids who came to the youth center, and they were hanging out. And I was talking to them, and I think it was a push-up competition. And some of the sort of the regulars, local kids, were there, and they kind of strip down to the tank tops and they start pounding out these push-ups. And so one of the new kids says, I'm going to jump into this competition. And he takes off his shirt, and through on the top of his shoulder, on his right shoulder, he had this gruesome wound.
Oh yeah, that's right. You told me. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And we're all kind of pretending like we don't see it. And he jumps down and bangs out these push-ups, and it's quiet. It's quieter than we've probably would normally be in this youth center. And we're just quiet. And he pops up and everyone's kind of looking, and he realizes as he's putting his shirt back on that we're all looking at this wound.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be the adult in the room by pretending not to see what I see.
Yeah.
And he then says, "Oh, did you guys saw the scar?" And I said, "Yeah, man, that looked pretty gnarly." And he tells us that he got the scar when he was 9 by being shot by an Israeli soldier for throwing rocks. He would have been about 14 at the time that I met him, 14, 15.
So you're talking to him at 14. He's remembering 5 years earlier when he was 9 years old and a juvenile threw a rock at trained military in a tank or just fully armed. And their best response was drop him.
Yeah. And I remember he kept us immersed in this story. And he spoke very openly about it and told the story of coming to Canada and what that had meant for his family. But the way and the cavalier nature of just describing a through his shoulder injury.
In and out. Boom, boom.
In and out.
Huge caliber.
We could not wrestle with how odd that was. It was, using language now, it was absolutely disorienting for me. It shook me in terms of thinking about injustices faced by children. That had to be 20 years ago.
I have to say, we're lucky that he left Palestine and came to Canada and began to have different experiences within the community, because even if I hated the group leading the country, which in Palestine is Hamas, if my kids and family was completely destroyed by the other side and Hamas is gone, the first thing I do when the dust settles is I start Hamas too. Violence only delivers one baby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hate, violence, oppression. But the response to that can't continue to be different hate. So the response
that's what I mean.
Right? Exactly. But I think we have to disrupt it now, because I'm seeing a lot of anti-Semitism starting to emerge, and that's not the answer. Can't be. When Coates he has got this quote that really jumped out, is "You can't behold evil, then return and not speak on it. And segregation is evil." And when he came back, what was really interesting to me is that he immediately put it against the context that, in helpful ways, I think, and not unpredictable, put it in the context that he has lived and understood. So whether that being a Black man in America, of course it lands in terms of segregation. And there are states where you can't even talk about critical race theory.
That's a parallel I think it's really important to draw. I think we can agree that hate language that incites violence against another group, is the same as planning to do violence against another group, right? You're inciting a riot, so we understand how that works. But the ability to express my own values and my own point of view, that's not the same thing. And so some people don't want to have to deal with critical race theory. Some people are thinking this should be a part of what we're doing. There's a mechanism to work that through democratically. When it ends up being one elected group deciding to outlaw the other group's ideas and point of view, that's when I think we are squarely in a segregation is evil place. In terms of this is the road, and it just becomes more true the more we dig into it. Not necessarily, we're not at the end of where that's going, but we are in the place where that exists.
So how should we respond then? When if once the term segregation enters the chat, now we get a little bit more context about what he might have noticed, what he might have looked at, things about inequality and inequity, access to certain choices, or not having the freedom to come and go and to vote, or to make choices about who you are in the world. So segregation is not an unhelpful word for him to introduce into this piece, into this conversation.
And it's a really good point, because people like me could go, look, segregation is just saying they're trying to keep the two groups divided so that there's not conflict. That is not, so it's not two groups living well equally and just good fences make good neighbors, like Mark Twain
Right.
suggested. Segregation is, we have power, you don't. We decide what you will do. We make your choices for where you can. There's no freedom of travel, freedom of profession. There's just, it's like everything's limited, everything's controlled. So it's a bit like, tying your partner up in your basement and saying you have an equal relationship, you just don't spend time together. That's not reality. And so I think it's really good for you to unpack segregation that way, so that we know it is not just a technical term for keeping two groups apart. It is a term that suggests one group is perpetrating evil on the other group through this difference in power.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also segregation also, particularly in the U.S. context, as I think Coates is alluding to, is that you can start to see its impact over generations. So you can see how it grew into certain spaces. It didn't start where it ended. But if you look backwards from sort of the 60s going backwards, you can trace the threads all the way through to say, oh, I see how they got there. Mm-hmm. Whether you control education, whether you control voting, you can control the power systems, the courts, you can control all of these systems, then you start to subjugate another group of humans.
Yeah, and it's not, and this is the thing that I have to keep. It's weird how I want to go to this, a group of Illuminati of 20 men who are pulling the lever. The world actually couldn't work that way. That by the time you get to that point, human history shows us there's just a lot of murders and infighting, and it's a very dysfunctional place to be. When you say you can see the control that is being expressed over these groups, and we say it's the system, and then we say the system was built by other people who are white for their offspring, their progeny. Very rarely would there be a person who would say, I'm designing the future of humanity, and I'm going to put this legislation in place and this and this and this. And there's too much that would require too much intelligence. It's more of, I have these little biases. These are the right choices. In light of those biases, I will make these choices, and they get codified in the law. And somebody else is doing something else. It's the collective action of bias and stereotyping and prejudice, because we all own a little piece and we have a little part to play. And together you can see intention in the system. But there's not like, I always feel like we're letting ourselves off the hook a little when we say those people in charge and the power they exhibit or whatever. But I'm very much contributing to the collective action of bias and othering, unless I am undoing it in my own life just by being alive, right? But I'm part of the system with I'm contributing to the intention myself.
These closed systems that resist to these in-group systems are predominantly homogeneous communities that don't allow for diverse perspectives or voices will continue to replicate and build and strengthen systems that naturally are to their own good,
because
and it doesn't have because it makes sense
them together.
So
it's just the way things are.
It's the hardwiring. So if the answer then is, I think what we've been talking about for the last 3 seasons is really pushing past that to say it might be true that the path toward peace and justice is through diversity and inclusion, that actually you need more diverse perspectives, and you need to do the work of including those, which will be the hard work, which will be a ton of friction points all the way through, but it will end up in a better place because representation, other people's perspectives will be there. It will resist solely making decisions for an in-group, because it won't only be that group making decisions anymore.
Okay. I agree with all of that. And I would say that when people say, there's nothing you can do, it's the way it is, I would say that's a signal that there's something inside of you that's trying to normalize the power differential that you perceive on either side. And by normalizing it, embracing it, and saying it has to be this way because it is the way it is, I am lending my energy and stabilizing and ensuring it stays around. When I resist it, there's a thread there that I might be able to undo. Now it's going to be my own thread, what's going on in me. If we can, would you, first part of the question, from your point of view, am I describing that well in light of what you just shared? Because I have a follow-up question.
I think so.
Okay. So the question is, if a company in the Ukraine-Russia situation says, what are you going to do? We're a business. It's not our responsibility. Should we be saying, then you are contributing to the conflict? Because in your mind, the way things are, the way things must be, and you're going to continue to solidify those by operating. Or if they say, I'm going to withdraw and my part is to leave the market. Maybe that's the part I can actually do. What is the role of a company in an area of conflict? In 20 years ago, I don't think I would have ever brought this up the way I'm bringing it up now, but oh my God, it's all over the planet. What's the role of a company selling sneakers in Russia, for example? Does it even matter enough in your mind?
Yeah, it matters to the humans that work there. It matters because the humans that work there live and play with their whole beings with other humans. So I think what we've come to learn is that we don't get to separate it out anymore. Maybe it's a luxury we never really had and has been contributing to making us more divided and unsafe. But we didn't know. But now that we're coming to know that taking that human-centered approach is that. Take this example of your sneaker company, for example. I would bet that somewhere in that company there are a group of employees who are saying, I wonder if we're going to make a statement. And I wonder if that statement's going to try to both sides it. I wonder if it's going to be a hot condemnation over one or the other. I wonder if it's going to reflect what I believe and I view. And when it doesn't happen, we are seeing, and I know this across lots of university campuses as well, students are telling their post-secondary institutions that they're feeling betrayed. I'm feeling betrayed. I thought you cared. I thought you would make the right statement. Who knows what the right statement would be? But I thought, and it's showing up as a betrayal of who we want to be together. And so this human-centered is, I think, requiring us to think about our collective responsibility, even from within institutions or businesses or corporations. There are no more sidelines, it feels like.
Yeah. It's interesting when you think about, so when you think about a company responding. So we work with companies that were founded in Israel and have a huge Israeli population. And Israel has a huge number of people who despise what their current government is doing. The current government, which is being led by somebody who has been charged with felonies. I mean, what do you do then? What do you do when you have, because you just said, like, our people are looking, what is the stand? And you have some Israelis who are for it, some Israelis who are against it, some Palestinians who work there. I've heard Palestinians talk about how horrible Hamas is, obviously, and how they understand the justice. Like, you can find different people, different ethnicities and religions all over the place. And the company is stuck in this kind of, well, what's the right position? Because no matter what we say, we're going to run afoul of somebody. And by the way, if in doing any of this, we stop making a profit, then we're all, screwed. Yeah. We all lose our job. We go out of business. So I'm not sure, as a company, what do I do? Do I say this and make everybody mad and reduce our productivity? Do I jump full in and make a stand and maybe go out of business? Do I, what is their responsibility?
Well, we talked a couple seasons ago about performative allyship, and everyone loves to for a month or two in the summer. Lots of corporations slap rainbows on everything, and it's fun. And so,
Lots.
is that real? Is it actually trying to lean into what has that struggle for freedom, for visibility, for um, equality, what has that meant over time? Or is it just about access to uh, a different income and revenue stream, right? So this particular community or this particular group, I'm not suggesting that companies do that, obviously, that it's not a performative thing. And I don't even think you have to get political, but you could be human. And the human side is recognizing, in much the same way Coates did, that something's wrong. People are hurting.
Yeah.
And at the crux of what's wrong is injustice. And so he names injustice. And that to your point, the baby that can only be born is hate, and it just perpetuates. This is not a one-time sort of one point along the timeline. Any point you pick along the timeline is awful and has humans doing awful things to other humans. And so if we start thinking about how do you get to the place where you can do these other horrible things and stop seeing the humanity, those are probably the clues to say we should start there then.
Yep. And which is why the work that we do we were in Ottawa with a group the other week. And
thanks for the phone call.
Yeah, no problem. I didn't know you were there. Sorry. And we had a whole discussion about this before the call today, before the podcast. We were in this remote city, Ottawa, the capital of Canada, at the same time, and just didn't even notice working with people in the same community, different parts of the city. It's so crazy. But we were painting this housing community, and in partnership with the housing community in Ottawa, and it was, I mean, it's painting walls. It's about as transactional as you get. But the whole goal was to say, look, with a sort of transformative approach of being able to imagine what it would be like to need this community, to hope their waiting list is 7 years. So to be able to come from afar, new arrival, or somebody and part of the Indigenous community, you've got 3, 4, 6 kids. You're hoping to find a 2-bedroom house. Like, just put yourself in that, and then paint with us. And then afterwards, like, what happened? What did you mean? It was a very, very meaningful 2 days. But that's because we made the goal, the point, us. Like, who are we in the world? What are we identifying with? What's our solidarity with? Who are you using your voice to speak up for? Do you know who you should be using your voice to speak up for? How is your behavior contributing to this reality, to the lack of housing? And I assume there's a bunch of people on the call listening who might go, well, how am I contributing to it? I'm not contributing anything. I'm just trying to be a good law-abiding citizen. Then you're contributing the same way I am, the same way all of us are. We need to unravel this stuff in ourselves and in others. But then we have a company that, like us, and I want to go to a clip here. We're gonna listen to a clip where the clip has to do with quotes. He was asked about what he's afraid of. But before we do this, that example that I gave you about a running shoe company, Reebok, pulled out of Russia, but then found a distributor in the region in Turkey who could sell into Russia, sold the same volume of shoes to that distributor, and is just going through a third party. And you can find Reeboks for sale all across Russia. And I don't personally care whether Reebok shares in Russia or not. I do think it is an intentional manipulation of my point of view to say we are withdrawing and to knowingly know where your product is going on purpose. And I think that is ethically questionable. But I also think that decision was just a handful of people at a company. So when I meet a Reebok employee, I'm not going to hold that against them. But what's my responsibility with the brand, with the product? What's my responsibility with that, with what's going on there? What's my responsibility? I think Apple owns a bunch of companies in Israel. I don't know for sure. I know that back in the day, their fantastic glass screen was developed there. And Israel's a hotbed for amazing tech. I'm just trying to figure this out for myself. As I'm working through this stuff, what is appropriate? And at what point am I too afraid to do something, to speak up? Okay, so let's play this clip where Quotes is responding to this question.
And if you were nervous about coming out and speaking about Gaza, about the West Bank, even going to begin with, knowing what you would feel responsible for doing once you came out?
Yeah, I wasn't just nervous, I was afraid. I hear people talk all the time about how fearlessness is a necessary quality, and I have never had that. I've never had that in my life, and I certainly have never had that in my career. I spent 5 days with PowFest when I was over there, and then I spent another 5 days with a group of Israeli Jews, and I knew that whatever I was going to see, I had a sentiment. I couldn't express it like I just expressed it for you right now because obviously I hadn't been there. But I had a sentiment that what I was going to see was not going to be great. And I know that, A, because of my upbringing, and I know that, B, because of my vocation as a journalist, you can't behold evil and then return and not speak on it. And segregation is evil. There just is there's no way for me as an African American to come back and stand before you to witness segregation and not say anything about it. One of the hardest things was to come back and then to read the rhetoric of certain African American politicians who are defending this regime. And I couldn't understand it. I wanted to know if they had been to Hebron. I wanted to know if they had been to Masafayada, if they had been to Susha, if they had been to Tubat. Had they seen? Have they really seen, what is actually happening here? I don't know how anybody who benefits, who stands on the shoulders of our ancestors' struggle against Jim Crow, against segregation, could see what is happening right now, could see the bombs being dropped, 9,000 people dead, ungodly number of them children in service of Jim Crow and segregation, which we have exported, and be okay with that. I don't understand it. So yes, I have my fears. I do. I'm afraid right now, sitting here talking to you. But I have to measure my fear against the misery that I saw. I have to measure my fear against the promises that I made to the Palestinians who welcomed me into their homes and gave me the facts, to the Israeli Jews who welcomed me into their homes and gave me the facts, to the Holocaust survivors who welcomed me into their homes and gave me the facts. I have to measure it against my own ancestors, against Frederick Douglass, against Ida B. Wells, who certainly faced off against things that were much, much more perilous than going someplace, coming back and telling people what you saw. This is the minimum. It's scary. But it's also the minimum. And the fact that people are trying to suppress speech is not an excuse for you not to speak. It's always been this way for Black writers and journalists. This is our tradition, And so I feel, as I do feel the fear, I also feel that I am in good company because I'm in the company of my ancestors.
Okay, so the part of the quote that's interesting to me is, I have to measure my fear against the misery that I saw. Right? So with that in mind, and we think about these companies and these global leaders, they're responsible for the brand. They're afraid they're going to screw it up. But their first allegiance is to humanity, isn't it? Solidarity to humanity over a group of humans, over a small number who have trusted with money. How do you do that? How at what point does a stakeholder become equal in reality to the shareholder? Because I don't believe that's happening. Yeah, I believe.
Your use of the word solidarity is one that is interesting to me because I've had a couple different conversations, but one in particular in the last month where a person said, so I've noticed a lot on social media about other groups like Black Lives Matter and other other folks jumping in on this issue and wonder, like, what's up with that?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, it's the core tenet of solidarity. I mean, we understand this in a sort of a labor management kind of a worker to corporation piece.
Yeah.
Folks go on strike. Other unions will hear of the other thing going on at this local, and they'll join in. They'll bring donuts to the picket line, and they'll drive by and they'll beep the horn, and they will come out and walk the line with them in solidarity, because the sense is your issue is my issue. So it's something I'm currently struggling with. And if a win for you is a win for all workers everywhere, maybe your issue was my issue and we beat it. And so we've got to come out here. We have an ongoing responsibility.
I heard a lot
Or
from the Asian community, or even Asian communities, who are like, guys, we should be out there, around the George Floyd time, saying,
Yeah.
look, we faced a lot of this too, so we should be
anti
showing up. Yeah.
the rise of anti-Asian hate. And so
Yeah.
you did see a lot of conflating of struggle, because people started to see themselves reflected. So your issue is my issue. Your issue could have been my issue, but it used to be, or it could be in the future. And so I better pay attention. And so you have a lot of synergies and in these allyship solidarity moments. But there's a commonality, I think, that draws people out. They tend to feel powerless, so that there is some around organizing the powerless so that you can sort of touch power.
When you say powerless, can you define that for us?
The feeling of powerlessness, so that they lack the access or the ability to make choices, or all of the important choices that other people seem to not have to worry about, that are more accessible to other groups. In fact, there's a controlling or a limiting of their choice architecture. You can have this or you can have this, but you can't have the full suite. And all they've had to do is, maybe they didn't know that there were more choices. So for a long time, it felt okay. But as you start to become more aware, you bump into the edges of the choice limits and say, there must be other things. Maybe this is why one of the reasons I think you limit education in these struggling, when you're trying to subjugate folks and keep them oppressed. The last thing you want them to learn about is other liberation struggles. You don't want people to read that it was possible somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so,
which was the West's terror of communism.
Right.
Not that it was a competitive political system, it was, but that all these disenfranchised individuals who are behaving here, we do not want that disruption in our society, obviously. I'm not being facetious saying that. I'm saying that's a normal reaction, not to want that disruption to spread.
Well, in these solidarity movements, what you tend to find creeping up is this coming out of this feeling of powerlessness is a request for one thing: equal treatment. Not better than, equal.
Yeah.
We want the same, and we recognize to get the same, someone else may have to give up, so that it balances the scales. So it is a bit disruptive to the current power structure in the status quo. But the request is just same, often is equal treatment. And what folks say is, most often the limiting factor is an identity, a piece of their identity, or a piece of who they are in the world. And what's interesting is, very rarely do you get, so if you think about it in terms of the worker corporation kind of dynamic, you don't get other businesses running to each other in solidarity. It's the powerless that are seeking each other out.
You're right. Unions go across companies.
Yeah, companies don't go, hey,
wait, there is one area where companies do feel disenfranchised, where they lobby together. The fossil fuel industry.
Taxes. They organize against the systems
that they feel have more power than them. So it is the one time where they come together. Poor companies.
Poor companies. But your use of solidarity, that's what it got me thinking about.
Yeah.
Is that how it does bring folks together in this case, but it does feel like a bit of a movement, though. Over the last number of years, there's a compressed energy of solidarity. So it feels like it's going not issue to issue, but sort of a collection of injustices and grievances that are thematically similar,
Working through all these questions.
even though they show up differently, because the common enemy tends to be the systems, not necessarily the people, but
Not
the
the people.
power systems.
Yeah. Yes, that were created by people. Obviously, all of us collectively acting in light of our own best interests based on what group we are part of. That's normal. There's nothing not normal about that. Just doesn't mean it's very helpful. It's not very helpful. It's not a great way for human being. It's been our plague since the beginning, our distrust of other groups. And now we have this. I'm going to go back to this one thing before we wrap up here. You've got a company with representation from all these groups working in all of these places of conflict. And they basically just say, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. What could they say? Even against, I have to measure my fear against the misery that they saw. Even when a leader goes and sees that misery and is impacted by it, what can be done? Like, I'm legitimately asking that question because obviously I don't know the answer to it.
When I listen to Coates and that whole interview and recommend that to the listeners, you can hear a person who's wrestling with what is it going to take to be a leader in this space right now, and he's trying to shore himself up with courage or bravery. Like, what is that brave moment that you need to speak truth to power? Which is just, I need to tell the truth about something. I can't even land on it. So maybe you don't have to speak until you do the work, but you have to do some of the work to figure out that quest of truth, right? So you don't have to rush into it and be stupid and be clumsy and hurt people. But you have to do the work.
That
internal journal.
Say. Oh my God, that is what I say. I'm like, your CSR, your community investment program is never going to go beyond your own internal work if you're the leader. You're the gatekeeper of the meaning of it, of the solidarity that can come from it. Just how far are you willing to go inside of yourself, which is a horrible, horrible thing to have to work through. I mean, it can be so miserable, but that's the way forward. And so if somebody said, what am I supposed to do? I would say to the individual who said, I can't be responsible for what our company is supposed to. I mean, come on, we're a company. This isn't our job. And I go back to, it doesn't matter who pays you. You're a human being, right? Being a human being with the rest of us is the damn job. Everything else is just providing you the means to do that job. You get a paycheck, you eat, you live, you're housed, all so you can be the best version of your humanity possible, which may not be a lot given your context. That's fine. But I'm going to reference one thing. I don't know if it's going to go in, but do you remember when Ethel told us a story about kicking the cat?
No, I don't.
So we were walking along and somebody was like, how long do you work with these people on the streets before you start to expect something, a change? Okay. I get it. We learn that as parents. I'm only going to teach this so many times. You're going to have to live with the consequences if you don't. Blah, blah, blah. This is not the same thing at all. But I get that we try and move these models around. And so Ethel, she was saying, somebody confronted me with that. And I told them the story about Larry. I don't remember what his name is. And Larry's walking along, and Larry has been living on the streets for decades. He's so ill. He's so sick. His internal organs are so eaten up by drinking Lysol so often. He's just a mess. He's on and off his meds. He's in and out of jail. Nobody cares for him. He's alone in the world. And it's a tough road. And he's angry. He's angry all the time, like any of us would be. Constant pain from his teeth, the whole thing, because he can't get his teeth pulled and all this kind of stuff. And he's walking along and he's shuffling along, and walking about is about as much as this guy can do, just shuffling along the street. And this cat runs out in front of him and stops right in front of him, right in his way. You know, cats, they're like that. They're just like yes. Right on your feet. And this cat just stopped. And Larry looked down and his fists clenched and he pushed his foot back. She said, I knew he was going to boot that cat as hard as he could. And then I saw him just sort of come to himself and think, nope, I'm not going to do that. He put his hands down and he walked around the cat and kept going. And this is where that phrase, that was the best that Larry could do that day. That was his highest level of contribution. He didn't kick the cat.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where some of us are in this. Like we're at the bare minimum of a place, but you're so right, Jacob, that the first step is not the company's response. It's not organizing, and all those things are great. But if we haven't taken the first step internally, then the rest of that is just maybe misinformed good intentions that's going to land at best performative.
Yeah, and at worst cause new and additional harms, right? So people who are already hurting will not be made better by any comment you make or any statement you make.
Yeah.
And what they need from, it turns out what we need from each other, some of the basic pieces, which is we need to be heard, we need to be seen, and we need to know that our contribution matters, both interpersonally, but then also scaling it out, sort of our relationships to the systems and structures around us too. But it's a good proxy to do it relationally.
Okay. So and I think it's also a good proxy in terms of calling us to remember what matters. So none of us should watch that or be aware of it and not initially be horrified that
Right.
lives inside of us. First, we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that that's their problem in that context at that time, and I would never do that. The stuff that made all of that possible for decades, for millennia, lives in you. We can actually see it on a microscope in your DNA. It's in you. But there's hope that it doesn't have to be. If we're willing to face that stuff inside of us, the Palestine-Israeli conflict that resides in us, then there's hope that we won't be owned and managed and measured by that we'll do better than kicking the cat in our life.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, pick it up next week.
Sounds great.
All right, thanks, Jake.